Welcome in, everyone. We're diving deep into Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning today.
A powerful choice. It's one of those books that tends to stay with you.
You flagged some seriously thought-provoking excerpts, too. Seems like you're really interested in the core of logotherapy, like how Frankl actually came to those conclusions.
Yeah, it's a philosophy practically forged in fire, right?
Yeah,
Which just makes unpacking it that much more fascinating.
exactly. So we're going to dig into those core principles, but even more importantly, I think, we're going to ground them in Frankl's own journey. The anecdotes and those raw reflections, that's what makes this book so powerful.
Absolutely. Because Man's Search for Meaning isn't just about what he says, but what he lived. Understand that context, and it hits completely different.
Right. So you shared Gordon Allport's preface, and I got to say, that comparison between Frankl and Freud, it's such a fascinating place to start, don't you think?
It's subtle, but it kind of sets the stage, You've got these two brilliant minds grappling with what drives us, what makes us tick, right? But Freud, he was so focused on the idea that most of our struggles are neuroses. They came from, well, frustration in our sexual lives.
And then you have Frankl coming out of the horrors of the camps, seeing something else entirely.
Exactly. This despair, this feeling of utter meaninglessness. It wasn't about some repressed libido, but about life itself feeling pointless.
And that right there is where logotherapy is born, this drive for meaning.
Exactly. It's not about chasing some vague happiness, but actively seeking meaning in your life, even or maybe especially when you're facing suffering.
Which brings us to those very first moments Frankl describes at Auschwitz. Just the initial shock of arrival, the finger game selection, it's just unimaginable.
Where a flick of the wrist, a completely arbitrary decision, could mean life or death. The dehumanization is instant.
And the deception, I mean, the signs over the crematoria, the word bath, in all those languages, just this awful, ironic promise. And that ever-present image of the chimney smoke.
A constant reminder of the threat hanging over everything.
And yet, in the midst of this, he talks about this eerie emotional numbness, which seems kind of paradoxical,
It's a common response to trauma, though.
Yeah.
The mind's way of trying to cope, to handle that intensity.
Like he's almost observing his own experiences from a distance.
Yeah, exactly. As if finding a tiny sliver of control, just a bit of distance, in a situation where all control has been ripped away. It's a coping mechanism, fragile, but it's there.
And that's just the beginning. He goes on to detail the systematic stripping away of everything. Possessions, clothes, their hair, even their names replaced with numbers.
The ultimate goal, total dehumanization. Every aspect of their former lives, their identities, methodically erased.
Chilling. And yet, in this, he notes the human body's strange resilience. They couldn't even clean their teeth, and yet he talks about having healthier gums than ever.
It's wild, right?
Right.
This incredible capacity we have to adapt, even in the most extreme circumstances. Of course, it doesn't minimize the suffering, but it adds a whole other layer to the conversation of how they endured.
And speaking of enduring, there's that story about Frankl in his manuscript.
Oh, right. Even as he's being herded into the unknown, he's trying to save this piece of his life's work, the scientific book, and he's explaining this to a more seasoned prisoner. And the guy just looks at him almost amused and says, shit.
Shit.
Yeah.
It's such a small word, but in that context...
It carries the weight of the whole world, right?
Totally.
It's brutal, but it just highlights the reality of the camps. Everything they valued on the outside, their achievements, their beliefs, it meant nothing there. Survival in the most primal sense was all that mattered.
And yet it's interesting, he points out this lack of sexual preoccupation among the prisoners. You'd think with everything else that in an all-male environment.
It is a stark contrast. And Frankl basically suggests it goes beyond the shock. It's about that laser focus on basic survival.
Yeah.
When you're fighting for your next breath, your next crust of bread, other needs just fade. It's the hierarchy of needs in its most raw form, what matters when everything else is gone.
Right, like your body's in survival mode, so your mind kind of goes there too.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean their minds weren't active. It's just that their focus was different. Frankl talks about how politics and religion became these huge obsessions.
Especially the rumors about the war, right? Like any whisper of possible liberation would be analyzed to death.
Totally. It was like this psychological game, clinging to hope, however flimsy it might have been. Did they even really believe half of those rumors? Who knows? But it was something to hold on to.
Right, that connection to the outside world. And then there was religion. Frankl talks about those late-night prayers whispered in the huts. Like in those moments, faith offered something beyond the barbed wire, beyond the despair.
Exactly. When everything's been stripped away, those whispers of faith They're a way to reclaim a little piece of your humanity, to connect to something bigger.
It makes you think about those things we all turn to, right? When we feel most vulnerable. What gives us that sense of strength?
It's a testament to our need for hope, for meaning. Even in the darkest places, it finds a way.
Speaking of dark places, that story about the improvised seance in the middle of a typhus outbreak, no less.
Yeah, in those horrific conditions, they hold this seance,
Yeah.
and the camp clerk, seemingly in a trance, writes down VAE Latin for woe to the vanquished.
It's like something out of a horror movie. Frankl even mentions that the clerk didn't know Latin.
It makes you think about the power of the subconscious, doesn't it? Like, even if he'd heard that phrase once, years ago, and forgotten about it, the fact that it surfaces then, in that situation.
Chilling, like a premonition, given their reality.
It really is, and it makes you think, what do we carry within us, unknowingly, that might surface in those unexpected ways? Past experiences, fears, random bits of language. It's all there, swirling around beneath the surface.
Okay, so we've got the psychological games, the hope, the faith. But Frankl also talks about finding moments of solace in the strangest places, like on a forced march, exhausted, starving, in pain.
Yet he finds himself lost in thought about his wife.
Hmm.
He describes this profound peace, this testament to love's power, even in that hellscape.
He says he finally got what poets and philosophers have been trying to say forever. That love, real love, transcends just about anything.
The power of our inner lives, right? Even when everything external is stripped bare, we can still access that well of love, that connection.
And then there's humor. It seems impossible, but Frankl talks about it being vital.
Oh, absolutely. Humor allows you to step outside yourself for a second. Remember that anecdote about his surgeon friend yelling, "Action, action," to get them to work faster?
And after the war, Frankl jokes he probably couldn't break the habit. Imagine being in surgery and suddenly it's action, action.
Dark humor, sure, but that was their reality. And that ability to find humor, even there, speaks volumes about the human spirit.
It's not about denying the suffering, it's about rising above it, even for a moment. To take back a sliver of control, of perspective. Which leads us to Frankl's concept of the relativity of suffering, right?
Yeah. Our experience of suffering is subjective. It's all relative. Like that example of the prisoners being overjoyed when they realized their transport isn't going to Mauthausen.
Because even within that horrific system, there were levels of horror.
Exactly. Mauthausen was notorious. So being sent elsewhere, even if it's still a camp, was a win. It's a stark reminder that our concept of bearable, it shifts depending on what we've already faced.
It's a good point. Like, your sense of bad totally gets warped in that environment.
Totally. It highlights the power of perspective, right? And how our definition of good and bad, it's not fixed.
Right. Which kind of leads into another big thing Frankl talks about, that danger of losing yourself in that kind of place.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about this almost sheep-like behavior, this urge to be completely inconspicuous, to blend in at all costs.
Because any choice, any decision could be your last.
Exactly. So
Right.
you just disappear into the crowd, trying not to attract attention, hoping it won't be your turn next.
But Frankl argues that even then, even in the camps, man always has a choice. And he's not talking about some big grand gesture, right?
No. He's talking about those tiny, everyday choices that become even more significant in that kind of dehumanizing environment.
Like choosing to help another prisoner.
Right. Or sharing your meager food. Or finding a way to hold on to your dignity when all your basic needs are barely met.
He gives examples of prisoners who did just that, who found ways to hold on to their humanity in the most inhumane place imaginable.
It's not about being naive or ignoring reality. It's about recognizing that even when everything else is stripped away, you still have the power to choose your attitude. That little bit of inner freedom, it's a powerful act of defiance.
It's like that quote, I might be butchering it, but it's something like, "The last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances."
That's Frankl, for sure. He's saying that even in a place designed to break you, you still have that choice. And that choice, that freedom, it's what ultimately allows us to find meaning, even in the midst of unimaginable suffering.
So, assuming we accept that premise that we do always have a choice, how do you even begin to find meaning in a place that seems to have none?
That's where the why comes in.
His idea that we need to find our why.
Exactly. Frankl argues that we need to shift our focus from what we expect from life to what life expects from us.
Which sounds kind of backwards at first.
It does. But think about it. It's about finding a purpose, a future goal, something that pulls you forward, something worth enduring for.
Like, he talks about giving himself a future lecture to get through this horrible march, Picturing himself warm and safe, sharing his experiences, it gave him something to hold on to.
It wasn't escapism, it was defiance. Like saying, this won't break me, I will survive this, and I will use it to shed light on something profound about what it means to be human.
And that story of F, the composer who clings to this vivid dream about liberation, the hope it gives him is just palpable.
And yet that date in his dream passes, liberation doesn't come, and he just deteriorates, loses hope, and dies shortly after.
It's brutal, but it shows that link between hope and survival, right? Lose hope, you lose the will to live, and that can have real consequences.
It all goes back to Frankl's point. Even suffering, when it's unavoidable, has meaning if we choose to see it that way. If we accept it as a task, an opportunity to find our why within it.
It's a tough concept to wrap your head around.
It is. But there's also a weird comfort in it, too, that we're not just victims of circumstance, but active agents in finding that meaning.
So it's not just about surviving the unimaginable, but learning to truly live with it afterward, which I imagine is its own struggle.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where Frankl's work, logotherapy, becomes so essential. It's about more than just enduring the darkness. It's about emerging from it and finding a way to live fully, even with those scars.
And he saw this need even in people who hadn't been through something as horrific as the Holocaust, right? That's where the idea of neurogenic neuroses comes in.
Exactly. It's that distress that comes from those existential questions, that feeling of emptiness, of meaninglessness that a lot of us struggle with. And it's not necessarily rooted in some dysfunction, you know?
It's about needing that why, that sense of purpose.
And logotherapy helps you uncover that meaning, that why that's already there. Because even when life feels chaotic, unfair, we have the power to create something meaningful from it, to tap into something that resonates with us on a deeper level.
He talked about new dynamics, too, this idea that we actually thrive in a state of healthy tension, driven by that pursuit of meaning.
Yeah. It's not about erasing all tension, about chasing some blissful, static state of happiness. It's about finding what gives your life direction, what lets you face uncertainty, even suffering, with that sense of purpose.
It's about the journey, not just the destination.
Exactly. And maybe one of the most powerful images in the book, that story about Frankl carrying a single page from a Hebrew prayer book with him in the camps. This scrap of paper becomes this incredibly powerful symbol.
A tangible link to his faith, to something larger than himself. And it makes you think, what is our version of that prayer book page?
Right. What is it that we carry within us that gives us strength, that reminds us of who we are when everything else falls apart?
It's a powerful question to consider. What seemingly insignificant things hold a deeper significance when you view them through that lens of logotherapy? And what does that tell us about our own search for meaning?
It's a lifelong journey, that's for sure.
It really is. And on that note, we'll wrap up this incredibly profound deep dive into man's search for meaning. Hopefully, we've given everyone out there a lot to think about as they continue their own exploration. Until next time, keep searching, keep questioning, and keep seeking out that meaning that's uniquely yours.